To illustrate how presidential preference primaries work, let's examine the process that the Democratic Party used in 2004. I used the 2004 Democratic Party process because it was recent enough that many of you may recall the candidates involved, but sufficiently in the past that it is likely that few still have any real attachments to any of the candidates, positive or negative. The Republican Party, of course, had its process in 2004 as well. However, since George W. Bush was the incumbent president seeking renomination by his party for a second term as president, the outcome of the Republican Party's process was a foregone conclusion. Mr. Bush had no serious opposition in the Republican primaries in 2004. All of the action, so to speak, was on the Democratic side. There was a total of 10 Democratic candidates seeking their party's nomination for the president in 2004. Among them were former Vermont Governor Howard Dean, former Missouri Representative Dick Gephardt, Florida Senator Bob Graham, the Reverend Al Sharpton, Connecticut Senator Joseph Lieberman, who had been Al Gore's Democratic vice presidential running mate in the 2000 presidential election, Ohio Representative Dennis Kucinich, former Illinois Senator and Ambassador Carol Moseley Braun, General Wesley Clark, and of course, ultimately, it was Massachusetts Senator John Kerry who emerged as the Democratic Party's presidential nominee in 2004. And North Carolina Senator John Edwards, who had run his own campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, became Kerry's vice presidential running mate. Remember that the purpose of each state's primary is to select delegates from that state to attend the party's national nominating convention. The number of delegates that a state sends to the Republican National Convention or the Democratic National Convention is determined by formulas set by the respective parties. The Democrats held their national nominating convention in Boston, Massachusetts in July 2004. Since California is the most populated state in the country, it was allotted the most delegates to the 2004 Democratic National Convention, a total of 440. Texas is the second most populated state, so we might presume that Texas had the second most delegates at the convention. However, the Democratic Party's formula takes into account not only population, but also how well the party's previous presidential nominee fared in the general election in each state and the success of each state's Democratic Party in electing its nominees to other offices. Since the Democratic Party's candidates have fared increasingly poorly in Texas over the past quarter century, Texas was actually allotted fewer delegates to the 2004 convention than New York was, despite the fact that Texas was second in population and New York was third at that time. Democratic Party candidates tend to do much better in New York than in Texas, and that fact is reflected in the party's formula for allotting delegates to the National Convention. Here you see the number of delegates allotted to the 2004 Democratic National Convention for the remaining states. In states that conduct presidential preference primaries, voters turn out to their local polling places on the day of the state's primary to cast their ballots for their preferred presidential candidate. The numbers that you will see here are hypothetical, but illustrate how a primary works as a means of awarding delegates to the respective candidates to the party's national convention. The polls open at, say, 7 a.m., and voters take their turn in the voting booths to cast their ballots for their preferred presidential candidate. This process continues until the polls close at, say, 7 p.m., when the last voters cast their ballots. After the polls close, the votes are tabulated and the results are reported out. In our hypothetical example, John Kerry won 44% of the state's primary vote. John Edwards won 17% of the vote. Howard Dean won 17%. General Wesley Clark won 13%. And Carol Moseley Braun won 9%, respectively. Candidates are awarded pledged delegates in proportion to the percentage of the vote that they received in the primary. However, the Democratic Party has a rule that requires candidates to surpass a minimum threshold, say 15%, in order to receive any pledged delegates to the National Convention. Delegates are then reallocated among the candidates who did surpass the minimum threshold. So, in our hypothetical example, Carol Moseley Braun and Wesley Clark did not achieve the 15% threshold and received no delegates from the state pledged to their campaign. The votes are reapportioned among the candidates who did surpass the 15% threshold, in other words, John Kerry, Howard Dean, and John Edwards. And this produces a reallocation of delegates among these candidates according to a pre-established formula. So, again, in our hypothetical scenario, even though John Kerry got 44% of the primary vote, he ends up with half, or 50%, of the pledged delegates at the Democratic National Convention. Senator Edwards gets 30% of the pledged delegates from the state, and Howard Dean gets 20% of the delegates from the state. The next step is the National Nominating Convention. The National Convention delegates from each state that are pledged to the various candidates are named at each party's state conventions in rough proportion to each candidate's primary vote totals in that state. As we said, in 2004, the Democrats held their national convention in Boston, Massachusetts, in late July. At the national convention, the party's presidential nominee is officially elected by a roll call vote of the states, where the chair of the convention calls on each state's delegation alphabetically, beginning with Alabama, then Alaska, then Arizona, and so on, and ending with Wyoming. At some point during the proceeding, one of the candidates reaches the so-called magic number, that is, when a majority of the delegates have cast their votes for that candidate, and the party officially has its nominee.